Let's go over the muscle endurance chapter. So what is muscle endurance? So we're looking at repeated contractions over a longer period of time. So it's not an all-out effort like you would get with a sprint or powerlifting where you're given almost maximum effort for a short period of time. With muscle endurance, it's longer, more sustained contractions, something that you would see in like push-ups or lunges for a minute or sit-ups for a minute. That would be an example of muscle endurance. And for most sports, muscle endurance is pretty important. Unless you're going to be a power lifter, unless you're going to be a sprinter and you need explosive power, muscle endurance is traditionally used for a lot of different types of sports, like wrestling would be a good example, jiu-jitsu, if you looked at kickboxing, if you looked at soccer. So something that you would have to do sustained contractions over a long period of time. Rock climbing would be a good example of muscle endurance. Muscle strength doesn't do you a lot of good in a multi-pitch climbing situation where you're climbing several different pitches, meaning I might go up, let's say 33 feet and then switch over and then climb another route for another 33 feet. I've got to do that over a long period of time. So that would be an example of muscle endurance. So common muscle endurance testing, push-ups into fatigue, timed sit-ups, timed lunges, isometric positions like the plank where you're holding them. All of those would be common muscle endurance testing that you might see in any fitness regimen. So before you start working out or before you develop a program, when you're testing your muscle endurance, it's going to be activities like push-ups, sit-ups, lunges, or if it's going to be isometric, it would be like a plank where you're holding a static position. So you see that a lot of times, especially in yoga, where you're holding static positions, or gymnastics where you might get to a position and hold it like the iron cross when you're on rings. All of those would be examples of isometric activities that you would want to test for if you were involved in that type of sport. So chemical energy. This is important to understand because we need to know what the energy systems are producing and how they produce it. What are they using as a fuel source? What are they breaking down to generate adenosine triphosphate? So that's ATP. So that's our chemical gasoline in our body. That's our chemical energy. So you've got an adenine group and 3 phosphates. You break off one of those phosphates, and this is a simplified explanation, and that's going to release energy because it's a high energy covalent bond. So you release that, you go from a high energy state to a low energy state, you're going to release energy. So if you're in chemistry, maybe you've heard those terms before. So anaerobic versus aerobic glycolysis. This is extremely important when we're talking about muscle endurance. So anaerobic glycolysis, that's going to happen in the cytosol of the cell. That's where you're breaking down glucose. It's not as efficient. You're generating roughly about 2 ATP per molecule of glucose, and that's what you're using for muscle endurance activities. But you also have aerobic glycolysis. That's going to be more for the aerobic oxidative energy system. If you're going out, that's going to be the next module that we actually talk about. But it's a lot more efficient at generating ATP. So you're getting, some literature says 36 ATP, some say 38, some give a range, but you get the idea. Let's compare and contrast muscle endurance activities where we're breaking down glucose and aerobic oxidative activities or cardiorespiratory endurance training where you're getting 36 to 38 ATP. The difference here is the type of contraction that's happening. So with muscle endurance activities, it's moderately intense. It's not an all-out effort, but eventually you're going to fatigue. Lactic acid's going to build up, and that's going to cause you those muscles to fail. So you won't be able to buffer the amount of lactic acid that's building up. Here, the intensity, when we're dealing with aerobic glycolysis, the intensity is not so great that we can suppress the lactic acid. We can buffer that, and we are getting a lot of oxygen out to the tissue, and we're netting about 36 to 38 ATP to generate our chemical energy. So energy systems, time, and types of activity, those are all extremely important when you're thinking about how you're going to train. You always need to look at the sport that you're training for and making sure whatever you're doing, it's sport specific, that it's designed around the energy system that you're going to need for that event, and the time that you're going to go for, and the type of muscle fiber that you want to recruit. So let's just go back to the muscle strength module for just a second, and let's talk about the ATP-CP system. So we're running off the immediate source of ATP within the muscle. So events that are lasting about 10 or 12 seconds, they're all out. Sprinting is probably one of the best examples I can give you, or powerlifting. All out effort, and then you're going to fatigue. Then you have to rest. Whereas muscle endurance, what we're talking about now, is events that could last up to 2 to 3 minutes. They don't always last. I mean, we're getting to the extreme end. You would be at the elite level if you did push-ups for 2 to 3 minutes. So it just depends on the muscle fiber type that you're using. So moderate contraction, not all-out effort, or breaking down glucose to generate ATP. Sorry, I was about to cough. The aerobic oxidative energy system, greater than 5 minutes, right? So we use these other energy systems. They're not independent of one another. So if we were just starting off, the ATP-CP system gets us going. As it starts to fade away, as long as the intensity is not too great, glycolysis kicks in. It keeps us going until the aerobic oxidative energy system has time to kick in. And then as long, again, as intensity is not too great, we can sustain those contractions for a long period of time. I mean, you see people running marathons, right? It's not an all-out sprint. It's a steady pace. Their body can supply the tissue with enough oxygen to maintain that aerobic oxidative energy system, so they can break down glucose and generate a lot of ATP. So energy systems have a lot to do with the time of the event, the explosiveness of the event, the type of activity. So you always need to consider that when you're developing your training. So let's just say you're going to be an MMA fighter, right? Going out and running marathons may help you for those events, but it wouldn't be the best type of training. Going in and doing powerlifting, yes, you might be able to compete at the lowest level, but you're not maximizing your training. The best thing to do is to make most of your activities, and even your supplemental activities like running and weight training, you want them designed around the time interval you're going to compete at. So for a non-title MMA fight, you've got 3 5-minute rounds. So that's exactly how I would do my running. I would go as hard as I could, increase that intensity as much as I could take for 3 5-minute runs. So I get on the treadmill, run for 5 minutes, all out, until I just can't hardly take it. And then I'd wait for a minute, just like you would in between rounds. You get a minute rest in between rounds. Second round comes in, I'm on the treadmill again, run 5 minutes. Then I get a minute break. And again, that last round, all out. And then the fight would be over. So that's how I would design my run if I was in MMA. You're designing it around the sport that you play. So that would be a supplemental activity. Running would be supplemental. It's going to help me boost my cardio for the event that I'm doing, but I'm considering the amount of time that my sport revolves around. So yes, I can improve my cardio by going out and running marathons, but it might not be the best training for a 3 5-minute round session, because I'm not going to recruit the muscle fiber types that I need. I'm not going to have the power I need. And then, yes, I might have the cardio, but it wouldn't be at the intensity I would need it. So look at whatever sport you play or the training you do, what's the time that you need to go for? Are you dealing with powerlifting? Then short, explosive bouts. Everything's going to revolve around that time. Are you running marathons? Okay, longer distance, less intensity. Always look at the event. Okay, fast twitch, oxidative glycolytic muscle, FOG or FOG. That's what we're trying to recruit with muscle endurance activities. Those muscles have a lot of capillary innervation, meaning there's a lot of blood supply. Those vessels are feeding that muscle with oxygen, so they get enough oxygen. If we looked at these muscle fibers underneath a microscope, they would be kind of pinkish in nature. So they're not white like just traditional fast twitch glycolytic muscle, because we need blood supply. They're not that dark red. We don't need as much oxygen as you're going to need for slow twitch muscle, so they're the intermediate between the two. So you'll see a lot of different names for fast twitch oxidative glycolytic. You may see type 2A. So you got type 2A when it's fast twitch, you got type 2B, and you got type 2X, which is an intermediate between those two. And there are more than that. But most people will just talk about fast twitch and slow twitch. Well, there's two main types of fast twitch. And if you're talking about muscle endurance, then it's type 2A. If you were talking about fast twitch glycolytic, which is more strength training, that's type 2B. So you always got to think about it. Again, like I said before, pink, if we were looking at this underneath the microscope, we're running off glycolysis. And this next slide, if you understand this slide, you'll understand almost everything you need to know, or a big chunk of exercise physiology, because everything would link back to this type of information. I love this chart. For me, when I saw it in XPhys, I was like, this just connected everything that we're learning in this class. Pretty much, pretty close. I mean, there are some other aspects that you could link, but it might be a stretch. All right, so I talked about in the past slide type 2X. Ignore that for just a second. That's that intermediate between A and B fibers. So this is the muscle endurance here. So let's just look at slow twitch for a second. That's coming up in the next module. So contraction time, slow. Motor neuron size, small, because we don't have rapid contraction. Resistance to fatigue, high, because we're getting a lot of oxygen, as long as intensity is not too high and contraction rate is not too high. Activity, aerobic, so think running marathons, long distance events, a lot of repetitions of something, like hundreds of repetitions, right? Maybe thousands of repetitions of a really light weight. Duration, hours. I mean, we're talking marathon time frames here. Power, not a lot of power. Not going to do you a lot of good if you're out there in an MMA fight and you need to try to knock somebody out. Produce a lot of strength trying to submit somebody. It's going to be tough unless your technique is really good. Mitochondrial density, because this is all happening within the mitochondria. We're generating the ATP in the mitochondria, so therefore we would have a lot of mitochondria in these fibers. Capillary density, it's high. We got a lot of blood supply. Oxidative capacity, high. We're getting a lot of oxygen out to that tissue. Glycolytic capacity is fairly low. Yes, we're using glucose as an energy system, but we are converting those molecules of glucose to a lot more ATP within the mitochondria. Major storage of fuel, triglycerides. We're breaking those down into free fatty acids and we're using them as a fuel source. This is just the genes associated with that. Like if you had this gene, you would probably have a higher predisposition to having a greater amount of slow twitch fiber. So that's why I'm saying some of this is genetic, right? I mean, we can train this a little bit through a training, but we're limited. Our genetics predispose us to having certain types of muscle fibers. So, all right, now let's talk about muscle endurance. This is what we're really here for. This is what this module is about, but I wanted to do a comparison between the major muscle fiber types. Moderately fast. So contraction rate, moderately fast. Size of motor neuron, medium, because we can get moderately fast contraction rates. That should make sense. These two are linked together. Resistance to fatigue, fairly high. We can go 2 or 3 minutes with moderate amounts of contractions. Intensity. Activity used for it, long-term anaerobic events. So those 3 5-minute rounds would be at the upper limits of this. But that's why this muscle fiber type would be best for like an MMA fight. Maximum duration, 30 minutes. Okay, 30 minutes of duration. These type 2A, 30 minutes of duration. So like running a 5K. If that's all you did, you would recruit these types of muscle fibers, or you'd have a higher percentage of them. And it's also based on your genetics. Power produced, medium. So this is not all out power. This is sustained power that's moderately intense. Mitochondrial density, it's still high because we're still getting a lot of oxygen. Capillary density, intermediate. That's why if you looked at these underneath the microscope, they're going to be kind of pinkish. They're not going to be dark because there's not as much myoglobin. They're as slow twitch, but there's a lot more than the fast twitch fibers. Oxidative capacity is high. Getting a lot of oxygen to the tissue. Glycolytic capacity, high, because we're breaking down glucose to generate our ATP. Creatine phosphate and glycogen are our major fuel sources. So we're running off the immediate source of ATP, breaking it down. That's why if you supplement with creatine, it will have an effect on these muscle fibers and give you a little bit more endurance, but we don't know the long-term impact of that. Glycogen, breaking down glucose, and then there's the genes. I'm going to ignore these type 2X for a sec and move right to fast twitch glycolytic. So this is fast twitch oxidative glycolytic here, muscle endurance. The strength training that we talked about in the previous module, very fast contraction rate, power, all-out intensity, 1 rep max type of power, sprinting type of power, large motor neuron because you need fast electrical activity to get to those muscle cells so we can cause that rapid contraction. Fatigue resistant. Sorry, I can't even talk. Very low fatigue resistance. And then that should say short term. Somehow that got moved around. Don't know how. Anaerobic. 10 to 12 seconds is what we're looking for. I know it says less than 1 minute, but really we're talking about all out 10 to 12 seconds. Power is very high. Shot put, sprinting, 1 rep max, all of those would fit into this category. Power. That's what we're talking about here. Low mitochondrial density. That's the reason if you looked at this underneath the microscope, there's not going to be a lot of mitochondria. There's not going to be a lot of blood supply because we're running off the immediate source of ATP within the muscle. Oxidative capacity very low. That's why these fibers look all white. So think of a chicken. Chicken can't fly very far. Look at the chicken breast. For a farm-raised chicken, almost all white meat. That is type 2B, fast twitch glycolytic in an animal. Whereas if you looked at the chicken's legs, dark meat, can run around all day for a farm-raised chicken, that is slow twitch in the same animal. So comparing slow twitch and fast twitch in a chicken. Chicken breast, fast twitch, glycolytic, type 2B. Chicken's legs, type 1, can run around all day, a lot of blood supply. That's why it's dark meat. Glycolytic capacity, very high. But it's mainly creatine phosphate. There's a lot more use of creatine phosphate to replenish the ATP stores than what happens over here in the type 2A, the fast twitch oxidative glycolytic. So you could think greater use of creatine phosphate, phosphinogen, and less glycogen. Whereas here, more glycogen, less creatine phosphate. This is just getting us going. And then you have certain genes where individuals that have a greater percentage of fast twitch glycolytic will have certain genes. And you can change it again, like I said, through training. Sorry, I spent a lot of time on that, but that's a very important table. You know that. It will help you because you can link this stuff to VO2 max. You can link it to types of training, sport-specific training, you name it. You can link it back to these fiber types and then all these different areas that link to those. All right, so let's get pretty general. Let's take that table we just talked about and generalize a little bit so that you can see this by athlete. So for the untrained person, you're going to be about 50-50, depending on your genetics, right? Your genetics play a role in this. But let's just look by athlete, by training. If you were a middle distance runner, you're going to have 70% slow twitch, 30% fast twitch. Elite level sprinters, right? Running short distances in a short period of time, 80%. It's going to be fast twitch, 20% slow twitch. And those are going to be like in rectus abdominis, maybe your deltoid, the muscles that you use most of the day, even gastrocnemius tends to be higher than other muscle groups because in slow twitch because you use it throughout the day. And then if you were going to be a weightlifter, power lifters, this is not elite level power lifters, but just your hobbyist, 60% fast twitch, 40% slow twitch. And it's going to vary by muscle group. pH, this is extremely important for muscle endurance. Blood pH is normally about 7.2, 7.3. If lactic acid builds up and you don't do this type of training, you won't have the buffering capacity to deal with that lactic acid. By doing muscle endurance training, you start to save or store more sodium bicarbonate in the muscle. That allows you to deal with lactic acid as it builds up. If blood pH drops below 7.2 or 7.3 and you can't buffer it, it'll get out into the bloodstream, it'll make you sick, and it'll affect your homeostasis. The fastest way for you to get back is to get rid of a lot of acid quickly, and that's why if you do a lot of repetitions, you feel nauseous. Your body is trying to get rid of a lot of acid really quick, and you may vomit to get rid of that acid because you have a really low pH stomach fluids. So you get rid of that, the stomach acid, you can drop your pH. That's the reason you get nauseous. So large muscle groups, you got to be careful. If you do a lot of muscle endurance activity with those large muscle groups, you could really drop the pH level in your blood enough to cause you to become nauseous because you can't buffer it. So pH and performance. pH will affect your enzyme function, which enzymes are just collections of proteins, and so they won't function properly, and they can denature the protein within those enzymes. So that can be problematic if pH drops too low. Supplements for muscle endurance. So beta-alanine is an amino acid. So it's converted into carnosine. And so that carnosine can act as a buffer. That's one way people can supplement. We don't know the long-term effect. In the past, people try to eat or drink fluids with a lot of baking soda in them, and then they would get sick because the water was too alkaline. It doesn't work that way. But beta-alanine, clinical research has shown, can help you buffer lactic acid. So for muscle endurance events, it's small, but there is an improvement in buffering capacity. Nitrous oxide. This is normally beneficial for aerobic sports, but can help out muscle endurance because what happens is nitrous oxide causes the vessels to dilate, opening up so they can fill up with more blood and get more blood to the tissue. And then, so therefore, more oxygen gets to the muscle, and it reduces fatigue. Protein recommendations for endurance athletes, it's pretty high. 1.2 to 1.4 grams per kilogram per day for those athletes, or ultra endurance athletes. So people going out and doing the Tough Mudder competitions, Spartan race, 1.2 to 2.0. You can notice that's really close to strength training athletes. Just depends on the event. That's the reason the range is a little greater here than it is for strength training. So we need to repair those muscles once they're damaged. And then muscle endurance testing. We talked about this before in previous slides. But isotonic, where you're going through a range of motion, contracting the muscles through the range of motion. Push-ups would be a good example. Lunges. Isometric plank, holding a static position. So I know this was a little long, but it's mainly because of this chart here. But if you're going to be a kines major, this is important because you can link it back to almost every major subject you're going to learn in exercise physiology. You can deal with pH level, would link to this, VO2 max, tidal capacity. Like I said, almost all forms of training will link back to these slides in some way. You can link it to the health-related components of fitness. So like type 1 fibers, that's going to be more cardiorespiratory endurance training. Your type 2 fibers, more muscle endurance training. Your type 2B, fast twitch glycolytic, is more strength training. So you can link these up if you exclude the hybrids between the two. But if I were a new student to kines, I would focus on type 1, type 2A, and type 2B and know those well and know everything that links back to them. You do that, you'll do well in kines.